Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Analysis Group Life Sciences Symposium webinar series. My name is Ted Davis. I'm a managing principal at Analysis Group, and I'm joined today by three incredible guests. And we're going to be talking about antitrust issues in the life sciences sector. I'll introduce them first, and then we'll talk about some quick administrative points I need to hit. We're joined by Matthew Grennan, who's an associate professor of economic analysis and faculty co-director of the Robinson Life Science Business and Entrepreneurship Program at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. We're also joined by Dr. Mark Robbins, who's president and CEO of Kodiak Strategy Consultants. Mark has broad-based experience in the pharmaceutical industry for over 30 years. And we will hear a lot from him today. And finally, we're joined by Alexandra Russell, who's a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, based in their Washington, D.C. office. And we're also going to be assisted today by Macy Handy from our marketing department. Macy, if you could pull up the slide deck. We got a few administrative points to touch on before we get going. But everyone is in view-only mode and your lines are all muted. So to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A feature and submit it directly to me, and I will ask the panelists. If you're experiencing tech difficulties, we can assist with that too. So please just submit your concern via chat, and our technicians can assist. And the slides from today's webinar will be posted on our website next week, so you can access them there. We're also recording today, so I will try to keep the salty language to a minimum, but I can't make any promises. So maybe with that, should we get going? I think Alex, maybe first we can start with you. And Macy, if you could advance to slide number 2. There have been some very interesting and concerning developments, depending on your perspective, coming out of Washington lately. And perhaps I thought we could start with the FTC, if you wouldn't mind explaining where they're coming out on some new discussion around Section 5 of the FTC Act.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I think we're all generally aware of the policy shifts that have been occurring under the new FTC leadership. And one of the most noteworthy changes, at least in the antitrust perspective, is with respect to the Section 5 policy and guidelines that the FTC announced on November of last year. This policy is pretty significant in that it really is an extreme departure from the 2015 Obama era guidance. And that was really a one-page statement that provided that the FTC, in enforcing Section 5, would, 1, follow the consumer welfare standard, 2, evaluate acts under a framework similar to the rule of reason that we're all familiar with, and then 3, align the FTC Section 5 enforcement with the scope of the Sherman and Clayton Acts. And so in that way, the FTC's enforcement policy with respect to Section 5 would be very much in line with the way that federal courts have enforced the antitrust laws with respect to private litigation. The November 2022 enforcement guidelines departed from that 2015 guidance in a few meaningful ways. First, it broadened the scope of potentially unfair methods of competition that could potentially fall within the purview of Section 5 and be deemed anti-competitive under that section. And so in the second bullet here, unfair methods of competition pursuant to this new policy statement goes beyond competition on the merits. They could include, quote, misuse of regulatory processes, and beyond competition on the merits means conduct that is coercive, exploitative, collusive, abusive, deceptive, predatory, all sorts of descriptions, but notably not a lot of specific guidance as to what conduct may fall within the scope of this new policy. There's also a focus on incipient threats, and Section 5, pursuant to this new guidance, no longer requires a separate showing of market power or market definition when the evidence indicates that such conduct tends to negatively affect competitive conditions. So this is really an amorphous standard and has invoked a lot of criticism to the extent it does not provide specific guidelines for businesses to adjust their conduct to comport with the federal antitrust laws, and specifically Section 5. The FTC has provided some examples of the types of conduct that potentially could be at issue now under this more expansive guidance. And some of the examples we've already seen the FTC start to pursue at least investigations and complaints with respect to some of these things. Some of them are loyalty rebates, tying, bundling, exclusive dealing, practices that undermine the standard setting process or that interfere with the patent office's full examination of patent application. So right now, I think a lot of people are just waiting to see what will happen with this new enforcement of a broadened standard that does not have a lot of specificity tied to it. And so I know, Ted, you have a number of questions for the other panelists, but this is the general overview of where things stand at the moment.
Alex, thank you. That's incredibly interesting. That sounds about as broad as it is sort of uncertain in terms of what they're, how they're going to be thinking about this. Mark, I thought we could turn to you next. I mean, so hearing what Alex just said, you've been working in this industry for 30, 40 years and in so many different functions. And it sounds like the type of conduct that Alex has been describing really touches, I would imagine, a large number of those functions. What kind of most concerns you or jumps out to you based on what Alex just said?
Well, I looked at this from the perspective of advising my client in the role of a general counsel in a pharmaceutical company of where there would be a safe harbor. And looking at this, there is no guidance on what a safe harbor is. I look at method of competition with misuse of regulatory processes. And my question is, if you file a citizen's petition that you honestly believe has merit, could that be considered a misuse of regulatory processes? I don't know. That can delay entry of competitors potentially. It can set standards. It's really undefined. When they talk about beyond competition on the merits, if I try to increase at the time a product goes generic, if I try to maintain the brand by contracting the brand at a lower price with third-party payers, is that competition beyond the merits? I don't have the answer there. I think it could create potential issues. The interfere with the patent office's full examination of patent applications. People try to get patent applications through fairly diligently. My understanding is that there's issues both within the patent office and also with information sometimes that inventors have. And it's just nebulous what kind of actions the FTC is looking at here that they're going to second guess. And they look at these things in hindsight. And as Alex was saying, it's incipient threats. You don't have to actually show actual harm. There's no rule of reason standard here. So it's very nebulous, and it opens up potential for FTC to bring action. I don't know if the FTC brings action in these cases, if they're going to bring them in the administrative court within the FTC. I've had actions that have been in front of the administrative court there, and you don't necessarily get the most fair type of trial in the FTC. So it does create concerns.
I guess a quick follow-up on that is in your experience with assessing these types of questions, it sounds like the standard is departing a bit from kind of fact-intensive rule of reason that we're all sort of used to. What you just described sounds like really digging into whether those things constitute competition that goes beyond competition on the merits. That would be fact-intensive. Is it, in your experience, is like assessing issues around regulatory processes and things like that, is how fact-intensive is that?
I would think it'd be fact intensive. Is I'm proving right now. My understanding is on this, and I defer to Alex, is almost per se on unfair methods of competition. And, that I don't think if they determine that there's unfair methods of competition, there is no rule of reason applied. I think when you get going beyond competition on the merits, it does take some factual analysis, but it's still undefined and there's no guidance here. It seems very subjective.
Yeah, and I don't know, Alex, if that makes sense to you. It seems like you would need to really figure some of this stuff out and to figure out the competitive effect. You would need a pretty robust analysis, which doesn't sound like the FTC is contemplating for at least some of this conduct.
Doing away with the rule of reason standard does cut off a big portion of what, we typically would presume would be a big part of the analysis of whether this rises to the level of an antitrust violation. And so, again, there isn't a lot of detail in terms of what specific. There is an analysis that's set out in the guidelines, but it departs from the rule of reason analysis. And so, in that way, we just don't have we don't have a body of case law. We don't have any precedent to look to as to how this new guidance will be applied to particular facts and particular circumstances.
Interesting. And in the absence of guidance from the case law, my inclination would be to turn to an economist. I don't know if others on the call share that inclination, but Matt, what's your reaction to this? And I don't know if there's any particular practice here. There's the FTC. One of the examples they gave is tying and bundling. Is what are the sort of economic considerations around some of these things? And I imagine there's probably pros and cons to pro-competitive benefits and potential implications on the anti-competitive side too.
Yeah, sure. I think tying and bundling is actually a good example, maybe to think about, both why there typically is a rule of reason type of analysis, and where one might imagine things moving into a line where that isn't necessary. But even if it isn't, where there might still be quite a bit of fact-based analysis to determine that one is in this world of an unfair method of competition. So the basic idea behind let's say bundling to start with is that it's a discount. So that's the good part of a bundle, right? It's called a bundled discount usually. So I think Analysis Group is offering a few different life science panels. Right. And so, one version of this would be, I'm sure there's an outstanding like IP damages panel or something like that. And maybe Analysis Group is offering a discount if you sign up for the IP damages panel and the antitrust panel. Right. So great deal for those who wanted to sign up for both anyhow. Now you save money. In that sense, you think this is a very pro-competitive type of thing. I guess the things to weigh against that potentially are that this could make it hard for a single product firm to compete, even if its product happened to be better, right? So say purely hypothetical, perhaps there's some other consulting firm offering an antitrust panel, and maybe some perceive it as better because I don't know, their economist has more gray hair and has testified in court 150 times, something like that. But because Analysis Group is offering this bundled discount, folks might choose the Analysis Group bundle instead of this other single product panel. And there the concern is typically that there's some leveraging of market power in one of these product markets into the other, right? So this potentially this this dominant monopoly IP damages panel that analysis group has. Maybe they wanted to leverage it into the antitrust panel competition world, right? And so, that's where, we could potentially run into trouble. And that's why we typically apply a rule of reason analysis to these types of situations, to figure out what is the balance of this this sort of discount, competitive pricing effect versus the potential for leveraging a market power from one product market into another. I think one other thing I want to mention, because especially it's maybe especially interesting to think about in the life sciences context here. I actually was just at a conference where I saw a new paper Mike Winston has been working on, where they're adding in, when you think about one of these markets having either network effects or economies of scale, right, which you see in a lot of tech markets or life science markets. And really, what that does is it kind of exacerbates some of these potential negative issues, or it can exacerbate some of these potential negative issues, right? So if you think about, back to the example, I guess, of the panels, a network effect might be, maybe our viewers really want to be able to talk about the same panels at the water cooler at the courthouse or something like that. And so, that creates an extra incentive to all kind of converge on attending the same panel, which can then just kind of exacerbate that power that might have been had by analysis group with the bundled panel. And, of course, the worst case scenario that antitrust authorities might worry about here is, the fact that in the longer run, this might encourage, exit or discourage entry of, smaller single product firms that might in fact have very good products, right? One of the things we left out of this whole thing that, that's also interesting to think about in life sciences is the fact that some of those economies of scale might actually be some efficiencies that are, getting leveraged and then shared with consumers via the bundled discounts too, right? So there are really, I think, a lot of components to this from an economist perspective, at least, and I think that's why historically these have been rule of reason type analyses.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it does sound like, Alex, to come back to a point Mark made earlier, I don't know what is there any guidance you can give a client now about navigating this, or are folks really in a kind of a wait and see environment? It seems like that would be a real challenge in terms of giving advice.
Yes, it absolutely creates challenges in that it is a departure from guidance that has been in existence for almost a decade, going back to 2015. However, the FTC's policies, it's hard right now to determine or pinpoint what exactly the FTC is going to focus on and how it is going to enforce pursuant to this new guidance. Obviously, the FTC is limited in resources, so they can't go after every single potential incipient threat. And we've seen some inklings as to what the FTC may be targeting. So in that respect, there are some things, and I know we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes, are some particular business conduct that the FTC has been pretty laser focused on as of late. But at the same time, I think you're right in that we don't have any clear guidance from the FTC sitting here today as to where it's headed. There are no safe harbors, which is something that we do like to see, and that doesn't exist here. So it really is just keeping a very close watch as to the new complaints that are being filed, new investigations that are starting, and going back to kind of basic principles in terms of best practices and the like that I think have been standard for a while.
That might be a good segue, Alex. Maybe talk a little bit about the PBM investigation that was recently initiated by FTC. I don't know, Macy, would you mind advancing to slide number 3? Alex, this is a brief discussion. I guess this predates the Section 5 statement from November, but perhaps there's a connection.
Yeah, so it did, and this is unrelated to, it's not a Section 5 case or an action that's being brought by the FTC. However, when you look back at the guidance that we were just taking a look at, one of the primary issues that the FTC had signaled were rebates, and taking a look at how these rebates are being used to potentially limit market participation and competition. And so the PBM investigation is interesting in that congressional support for this investigation actually generated from the investigation into insulin pricing. And Senator Grassley submitted a statement in support of the FTC's Section 6B investigation, basically saying that there were issues that came to light during the congressional investigation of insulin pricing with respect to PBMs, their pricing structure, their market dealings. And so there is congressional support for this Section 6B investigation that was announced in June of last year. The investigation is into 6 of the largest PBMs, names that we've heard of: CVS, Caremark, Optum, and the like. According to the FTC, their inquiry is aimed at shedding light on several practices that have drawn scrutiny in recent years. These are things like fees and clawbacks that are charged to unaffiliated pharmacies, the ways in which PBMs are able to steer patients toward certain pharmacies that are owned by the PBMs. They're also, what the FTC has described as complicated and opaque methods to determine pharmacy reimbursement. And then the last bullet is important: the impact of rebates and fees from drug manufacturers on formulary design and the cost of prescription drugs to payers and patients. And so if you think about rebates do have a benefit in that. I think the way that we like to think of rebates at a very high level is that you get a rebate as a consumer and you pay a lot less for the drug. But the flow of rebates and the way that rebates are being used to potentially limit competition or place certain drugs on certain tiers of a formulary, that's what the FTC is concerned with, and that's what the FTC is hoping to shed light into. So the PBM investigation obviously started 6 months ago. They're going to be collecting documents from these PBMs, and we'll see what happens, but it's definitely an interesting turn. And I know that there's been a lot of parallel congressional interest in this, with various bills and the like being proposed in order to create more transparency with respect to PBM pricing and market dealings.
That's interesting. So, and Matt, I know you've got some research that looks at the effect of, sort of the economic issues around price transparency. That's obviously a big issue here. It's something you hear a lot about in the press. The idea that it could morph into some kind of antitrust issue, I think that's still probably pretty uncertain, whether it becomes a Section 5 issue or if there's some other way in which it matters. But it does seem like some way of thinking about what are the economic benefits and economic costs associated with increasing or decreasing price transparency. I think that'd be valuable. I don't know. Do you have any perspective on that you'd want to share?
Yeah, sure. So I think, one, besides transparency, another chunk of my research thinks a lot about contracting and vertical supply chain. So if we want to dive into the nitty gritty of some of these, I think really interesting issues that Alex was bringing up with PBMs, we can do that as well. But I think, just in terms of thinking about transparency as an issue, it might be easier to just think about it, a step higher and not such a complex context first. And I think the basic principles will sort of port over. So transparency is something that's, it's so core to how competition works in a lot of economic models, that it's almost kind of taken for granted, right? So you have things like buyers know and understand the quality of a product and the price they're going to pay for the product, right? So that's, what can lead to making better choices about what to buy, and then those choices also incentivize producers to increase quality or lower price, right? In things like firms knowing their rivals' prices, right, which allows them to actually compete by undercutting and pricing more competitively, right? So those sort of forces that require some degree of transparency, or I don't, maybe require is too strong a term, but are definitely facilitated in part by transparency, are pretty important to the competitive process. And so one can see there how the intuition for more transparency is better feels really strong, right? So as usual, there are some sort of potential competing forces, right? So in particular, the one documented area where transparency has sort of backfired in various markets around the world and throughout time is captured by what some often refer to as the Danish concrete effect. And the story there is one where in the Danish concrete market, once upon a time, there was a transparency regulation that was put in place, and prices actually went up. And the story there that economists have told, or some economists have told, is that perhaps what happened was this transparency provided a sort of centralized information gathering and monitoring mechanism that ended up really facilitating some sort of softening of competition or tacit collusion even between sellers, right? So that's like kind of one theory of how one type of transparency might backfire, right? So intuitively, maybe one way to think about it is that transparency, especially in markets where you have lots of different buyers that you might be negotiating different contracts with, can kind of act like almost like a most favored nation clause for everyone, right? So the extent to which I would have cut you a deal, but now that we're living in this more transparent world, if I cut you a deal, I know everyone else is going to see that deal, and that's going to make it harder for me to charge a higher price to them, and therefore that's going to disincentivize me to cut anyone a deal in the first place, right? That's kind of the idea that folks have in mind when they think about transparency potentially backfiring. The only other thing I might add is that another reason transparency might or lack of transparency, sorry, might sometimes be helpful would be the extent to which it's protecting sort of trade secrets or things, ways of doing business that a competitor has discovered that give it an advantage. And in that sense, that lack of transparency might help encourage innovation in that they can actually reap the rewards of any sort of innovative new processes they discover, right? So that's kind of one of the other forces I think to keep in mind when one thinks about transparency and information broadly.
Interesting. I feel like, Mark, you have probably had possibly more direct experience with any of these issues than all of us here on the call combined. I know as in terms of just your time in industry and the negotiations you've had with buyers and so on in the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, what's your reaction to some of this? I mean, the PBM, you've dealt a lot with pharmacies, you've dealt a lot with confidential prices and public prices. I mean, I'd love to hear what your general take is on this.
I think my general take on this is transparency is a positive. I've negotiated these agreements. I've been involved in them, and I still can understand pharmaceutical pricing. And I think part of the issue here is there is such a huge discrepancy from one patient to another patient, what they might be charged. Yesterday I had to pick up some prescriptions for my daughter, and I didn't have her insurance information there. It was over $2,000. Once I got her insurance information, it was $80. GoodRx, which gives you transparency, you look at GoodRx and you see you can get these prescriptions for $100. So there's that huge discrepancy. I was personally had to get a prescription coming out of the hospital for a generic antibiotic. My charge to the hospital to get it from the hospital dispense was $4,000. I went to GoodRx, I filled the same prescription generic for $66. You know, and so I think it's that huge disparity. And the question comes back, and I was asking myself this, is I'm getting generic prescription. Is generic company make any more money if I pay $4,000 for it than if I get it through GoodRx at 66? And the generic company is actually making the same money on that prescription. So it's where that money is going and where it's in the system. I think transparency would help.
Interesting. And that, so it seems like there are ways in which some of the conduct, I guess would affect other players in the industry, so the sense in which conduct in one's part of the supply chain affects others. I don't know, Alex, is there a way in which, say, this PBM investigation, focus on this, is there a spillover in any way possible for manufacturers or other people that are involved, other entities that are involved in the supply chain? It seems like a lot of this is PBM specific, but some of it could affect the way manufacturers do, say, rebating practices and the way those things kind of flow through.
Yes. So in the sense that the pharmaceutical payment chain is incredibly complex, and there are so many different players and various flows of payment between those players, I think it's hard to envision a world where this investigation doesn't somehow bring in all other players in the market. Not necessarily that what they're doing is anti-competitive, but PBMs, I know we have a chart later in this deck with the flow of payment in the pharmaceutical chain, and it's dizzying. It's hard to trace. It's an issue that comes up in a lot of our cases. But I can see a world where particularly spread pricing, the rebate process, those business agreements come under heightened scrutiny. The FTC is going to be looking at them, and we'll see what the FTC does. But I think as of today, there's been very limited information with respect to PBM agreements, how PBMs are determining their spread pricing, their rebate agreements. It's obviously not something that they want to share. And so we'll see what happens. But I can't imagine a world where this doesn't somehow pull in other participants in the payment chain.
That's a great point. Macy, could we look at slide 9 briefly? Well, there's one other thing to discuss after we get here, but I think, Alex, this is what you're referring to.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would just describe this as like simplistic at best, because there are probably like even more threads that we could and arrows and color coding that we could apply to this. But essentially, if you look at this is an overview of the pharmaceutical distribution system and flow of payments between the various entities involved in this process. And if you look at the pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, I mean, there are so many arrows flowing in and out to all other parties all along the distribution chain, that they're really at the core here. And that's how they've expanded their business. And that's why they're so important right now to the pharmaceutical industry, because they play such a central role and are truly at the center, as you can see, in terms of payment. So that's what I was referring to. It is very complicated, and you can imagine why the FTC is very interested in this, why Congress is very interested in this. And PBMs really have not been the focus of congressional investigations or FTC investigations, at least not as much as all of the other entities who are identified in this chain here. Obviously, insurance companies, brand and generic manufacturers have been the subject of FTC investigations for a very long time.
Yeah. And this research, this is based on obviously research conducted by researchers at USC, and there are probably other, as you're saying, there are probably other elements of the industry that could be captured here that would potentially loop in others. I guess, can we, just being mindful of time, I could definitely keep talking about the PPM investigation for the rest of our hour, but I wondered, could you advance to slide 4, Macy, and maybe we can talk a little bit about a lawsuit that is in a, obviously not a directly relevant to life sciences, but I think there are a lot of parallels that folks on the call might be interested in hearing about.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting lawsuit for any antitrust nerds or anybody, you know, involved in this industry, frankly. This was a complaint that was filed by the FTC in September of last year. They subsequently amended their complaint, and I think it's the motion to dismiss papers are fully briefed as of last month. But essentially, the FTC has brought an action under the Sherman Act, Section 3 of the Clayton Act, as well as Section 5. And again, under this is like the first major complaint under the FTC's new guidance for Section 5 enforcement. And the complaint is against Syngenta and Corteva. These are the two biggest manufacturer of pesticides. And the complaint alleges that Corteva and Syngenta's loyalty programs with pesticide distributors actually function as unlawful exclusionary schemes. And so the FTC has actually joined with 10 state attorneys general, and they've brought various claims pursuant to the state antitrust laws as well. So this is a pretty big coalition involved in this complaint. And the complaint alleges several ways in which the defendants' loyalty rebate programs with distributors harm farmers, smaller pesticide manufacturers, and consumers. The first is that these loyalty programs essentially provide an incentive for the biggest distributors not to purchase from other generic manufacturers of pesticides. And so by virtue of these loyalty rebate programs, Syngenta and Corteva have been able to maintain their artificially high prices for their pesticides even after their patents expire. And they share some of those proceeds with the distributors who aren't necessarily affected by, they don't really care whether generics enter because they're getting low prices. And even if generics could offer lower prices, the FTC's theory is that the distributors are just able to pass those costs on to consumers and farmers. And so the FTC has really been looking at what the end payer, what their injury is. And so the FTC's allegations here are really unique because we have a loyalty program that is being challenged as anti-competitive, even though there's no allegation of predatory pricing. And so this is really a novel complaint, and the defendants have responded in saying that this is just such a departure from the standard case law holding that when price is a core feature of a loyalty programs, courts will not condemn the program as long as the reduced prices are above cost and are not predatory. And that's what they say we have exactly here. And so, of course, Syngenta and Corteva have been fighting very strongly, and they've been arguing that this is just, the FTC inventing a new standard for loyalty rebate programs under Section 5. It is untethered from the case law. The FTC has come back and they've said, no, you're harming consumers. This is exclusionary conduct. And specifically, the FTC has pointed to some emails that they obtained during their investigation, which is, sort of a signpost or a warning for everybody who advises companies on a regular basis as to what not to put into email. But one of the emails that they cite is from a Corteva manager who boasted in discussing the loyalty rebate program that, quote, "Our team has truly done an A+ job blocking generics." So the FTC has access to all of this information that a typical private litigant wouldn't have, and they're now deploying this to make this very unique argument, a novel argument, that this loyalty rebate program is in fact aimed at blocking generics. So we'll see what happens and how this shakes out. The court hasn't ruled yet on the motion to dismiss, but it's very interesting. And it's going to have a lot of implications for a variety of market participants and potential defendants down the road.
That is fascinating. So I guess I do want to get into the implications for the life sciences industry with Mark, but maybe first, Matt, if you could talk a little bit about sort of the economic perspective on a loyalty program. I mean, I know as a consumer, sometimes you sort of get used to a particular branded product, and I could see potentially farmers, to get used to a particular brand of pesticide. It's useful in their operations. They know how it's going to work. And they've got a lot of sort of on the ground experience with it. Not a lot of people know this, Matt, but one of my nicknames at Analysis Group is Farmer Ted, because I also do, in addition to doing life sciences work, I also do work in the agricultural industry. And I know, there can be like pretty strong preferences in terms of what products you're going to be putting on your land. And so I wonder, if you could talk a little bit about that. What are the, obviously I can think of some personally pro-competitive things that I would see. What are the kind of what's the broader perspective on the pro-competitive and anti-competitive perspective on this?
Yeah, you bet. So no one has ever called me Farmer Matt, but I did grow up in the cornfields of Illinois and was an engineer at Iowa State before I became an economist. So I also have an affinity for the industry. And I completely agree that actually, there's a huge overlaps between kind of ag biotech and, the broader life science and healthcare sector in terms of just economic features of the institutions and the industries, right? Like you could kind of think about hospitals and physicians or something instead of, farmers and distributors and so on, for example, right? And I think one of the things that it's kind of interesting about this case, or the economics of this case, is that I think as Alex was saying, right, in one sense, a loyalty program has a lot of the same economics as the bundling and tying we were talking about before, right? It's just now we're bundling a purchase in the future with a purchase today, or something like that, right? And you can kind of think about some of the same economics, and that's where the original guidance around not having some sort of predatory pricing comes in trying to find an area there where it's unlikely that that sort of bundle is going to have anti-competitive effects, right? Now, I think what it sounds to me like this litigation is keying in on is the fact that sometimes you have disparate players in a particular marketplace, and those players might have differing incentives. And so by offering some sort of loyalty rebate to one that's kind of maybe purely wonderful for them, you might be disadvantaging some other player and extracting some surplus from that other player in the process, right? Obviously, that's going to be a very context-specific sort of analysis to figure out the balance of what's going on in a setting like that. But I mean, probably the easiest one we can think of are something like credit card loyalty programs, where we get maybe some bonuses on our purchases, and perhaps that creates some leverage with merchants, for example, or in maybe the broader healthcare context, right? You could think of sort of anti-kickback statutes towards physicians as being related to the same sort of thing, right? The extent to which you might be able to be offering some sort of something attractive to one party who's making a decision in a supply chain, and maybe that's creating some power with hospitals or insurers who are paying for the products at the end of the day, right? And so I think that's really the economics of what this sort of this case is keying in on here, is this fact that you have these differing parties, and a rebate to one may create leverage with the other, and kind of depending on the facts of the situation, that could be potentially an anti-competitive thing.
Interesting. Okay, so Mark, do you hear some obvious parallels to life sciences, or how is this resonating with you?
Well, it's in quotes, loyalty programs. I don't think in the pharmaceutical industry, I would call them loyalty programs, but there are safe harbors for what pharmaceutical companies can pay to distributors for services that are a fair market value. And the concern is that this is going to be challenged and erode that, those safe harbors there. The distributors do provide meaningful services to their customer, to the pharmaceutical companies where they're purchasing the products from, processing the chargeback rebates, maintaining the inventory, tracking those aspects. And so historically, you have negotiated with them where you will pay what's a fair market value. And of course, that's tied to generating business or doing business, buying your products. To my knowledge, that has not been challenged recently, as long as you're within those safe harbors at this point. But this could be a slippery slope.
And isn't there also, Mark, a kind of a parallel to the the PBM rebating practices you talked about earlier, where my sense from what I've learned about the industry over the years is that there are sometimes PBMs will keep some portion of rebate, sometimes they won't. That a lot of that is essentially the manner in which the PBM is compensated for the services it's providing to its client. And so I think you do have to balance the kind of rebate issues and the opacity that we talked about earlier, and any kind of potential anti-competitive effect that might come in with some of this new guidance, with the fact that, look, I do think a lot of that is just is in lieu of sort of a direct kind of more transparent administrative fee.
Absolutely. And PBMs do drive down costs to the patient's lives that they're covering there. The question comes back to, do the patients see all that money or part of that? But the PBMs do, and that's how they started, was providing a very valuable service for driving down price.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks further to the issue of safe harbors, like you talked about, and sort of where we are with what kind of conduct is permissible and what's not. I guess, so mindful of time, I do want to talk a little bit about the information sharing guidance that came out last month from DOJ. Macy, would you mind advancing to slide number 5? Alex, do you want to talk about this? I'm happy to talk about it too, if you'd rather.
No, I'm happy to give a quick overview. So, sticking with our theme of safe harbors slowly being eroded, the Department of Justice just last month withdrew prior guidance with respect to safety zones that applied to information sharing among competitors. This guidance was specific to the healthcare industry, but essentially the prior guidance that has existed since the 1990s. So many players in this industry have been relying on it for many years. Antitrust agencies have identified a safety zone within which data exchanges are unlikely to raise substantial concerns to the government. And in general, the policy was that DOJ wouldn't challenge a particular data exchange if it fell into one of into these 3 categories. So the exchange would be mandated by a third party, like a trade association requested it. The information provided by the participant was more than 3 months old, so somewhat stale. And then the third safe harbor was that at least 5 participants provided the data underlying each statistics shared. no single provider's data contributed more than 25% of the weight of any statistics shared, and the shared statistics were sufficiently aggregated such that no participant could really discern the data of any other competitor. So those safety zones are now gone. That the DOJ withdrew the guidance, referred to it as out of date, overly permissive. So, and the rationale that the Department of Justice provided is laid out on this slide. So right now, we're living in a world without the safety zones and safe harbors that we've been talking about, at least with respect to informational sharing. Again, we don't know what the Department of Justice is going to do in the absence of the safety zones and how it's going to enforce in a way that may be different from prior practices, but we don't have these safe harbors to provide as guidance for future conduct.
So this is a fascinating area, and this is very it's concerning from the standpoint of folks like us that like to rely on reliable information and reliable data when we're conducting our work. And so, Mark, I don't know, what's from your industry kind of perspective, obviously, industry-wide data are so important in thinking about how you benchmark your performance, how you sort of just assess your business and make decisions. I mean, what's we've talked a bunch today about the removal of these kind of safe harbors. What's your reaction to some of this?
This didn't bother me as much. I like to safe harbors and like to see where they're coming. Data is still available out there on prescriptions with IQVIA. You'll get the information. You don't share pricing information, but the information to be competitively priced, you can find that out from the wholesalers from other places there. And so I think there's still mechanisms to get the information. The problem here is it's going to make it seem like any information that's shared, though, could be considered problematic. It's not really defining what the data are that they object to. So if you share with the trade association, I'm a member of pharma, and I share certain information with pharma, that could be challenged. And so from a standpoint of business, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. From a issue with dealing with trade associations and groups, it could be very limiting.
I guess I do have a little bit of concern, this whole 3 months old point in here, where even based on this guidance, it's possible that even sort of tried and true data sources like IQVIA that you've thought about, where you can look at information at the NDC level, in some sense that could come in and could be viewed as problematic, which it seems like if it were to be taken to that extreme, it seems like that could have a pretty significant effect on operations. And then, Mark, I think you'd be in your world of you need to essentially do an on the ground data gathering every time you want to understand what prices are by calling every one of your customers. And maybe that's the world that kind of DOJ would prefer us to be living in, but that seems like a challenging one. I don't know, Matt, do you have I know you've thought a lot about how innovation happens and how sort of information flows into that. I don't know, is there a perspective you have on this? I mean, I think there's some amount of, what services are people using to conduct their business, but does this sort of change in the DOJ stance? Does that give you how does that make you think about what's likely to happen in this industry where innovation is such an important piece of it?
Yeah, I think really kind of two things come to mind, when I look at this situation here, and one is kind of related to the role of information that we were talking about before, but maybe thinking a little bit more in terms of how firms are using it. And so, these are sort of the sort of things that I think typically would come out in discovery if there were a case brought, right? But there's a kind of a question of, are firms using information to kind of soften competition and kind of know what not to do? versus our firms using information to kind of benchmark and compete against and incentivize themselves to do better than their competitors, right? I think like that might be, you know, overly simplistic, but in a nutshell, I think those are kind of the two types of forces that we're thinking about here. And one might think that, you know, in a given case that, you know, the facts would start to push in one direction or another there. So I think that's maybe kind of the one broad thing. The other thing that, you know, I find especially interesting, my other, you know, hat here is teaching data analytics to MBAs and executives. And that seems to be another piece of what, you know, what's bringing up this concern and kind of why now here is this fact that, you know, kind of modern data analytics and modern algorithms and kind of using those in business practices, you know, may have changed the extent to which we think certain types of data might be problematic or certain uses of data might be problematic. And I think, you know, that's a really, you know, to use an antitrust buzzword, it's like a nascent nascent area of inquiry, I think, in terms of, you know, economics and data science worlds. And I think an interesting one, you know, but one that's worth taking seriously. I'm not sure where the facts will end up, you know, playing out on that front, but you can see that it seems like that's part of what the DOJ is concerned about here.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in principle, I do like the idea that, you know, guidance evolves as industries evolve. I mean, obviously it should. It brings up a little bit of a question, which I've had, that if it is true that there is so much information available and we have machine learning and algorithms that we can run, you know, maybe at some point we should really think strongly about the preclusion of the pass-on defense. And how challenging it is to measure overcharges, because I think economists would all say it's possible, it can be done. That's my little soapbox, I suppose. But this has been, I know we're out of time now. This has been fascinating. I wanted to thank all of the panelists, you know, for spending so much time sort of thinking through how we wanted to do this and what topics we wanted to raise. And thank everyone that is listening for joining us, and thank the folks in our marketing and IT team for helping us set this up.